Sometimes the quietest decisions are the ones that make Washington nervous. The rain over Briscoe County, Texas, came down in a thin gray curtain that turned the courthouse lamps into pale circles of light, and Sheriff Nolan Briggs stood alone beneath the awning of the small white church on Maple Street, holding a simple gold band between his fingers as if it weighed far more than metal should. The town was asleep, or at least pretending to be. In places like Briscoe County, people learned early that silence could be a kind of agreement. A train horn drifted from somewhere beyond the cotton fields, long and low, and Nolan slipped the ring back into his coat pocket while the wooden doors behind him rattled softly in the wind. 2 days earlier, none of this had existed. No ring, no whispers, no men in dark government cars driving slowly past the sheriff's office as if measuring the town with careful eyes. 48 hours earlier the world had been simpler. Texas, late summer of 1944, where the heat clung to the land like a stubborn memory and the roads shimmered in the distance like water that wasn't there. The sign outside Camp Ashford stood straight and unromantic beside a gravel road. United States Army Prisoner Labor Program. Beneath it hung another sign, smaller but harder in tone. No fraternization. The letters had been painted thick and black, meant to be understood even from a distance of 50 yards. Sheriff Nolan Briggs had read that sign more than once. Not because he needed reminding, because men in his position knew the rules were never written for people who expected to break them. Nolan was a tall man with a quiet way of walking, the kind that made wooden floors creak only after he had already crossed the room. His badge carried the dull shine of years rather than polish, and his job in Briscoe County rarely involved anything louder than settling a fence dispute or reminding teenagers that Main Street wasn't a racetrack. War existed here mostly through newspapers and the empty seats at church where young men used to sit before boarding buses headed for places with names like Normandy or Sicily. The prison labor program had changed the rhythm of the county. German prisoners worked the surrounding farms 5 days a week under military supervision, and most of the townspeople preferred not to look at them too closely. It was easier that way. Easier to keep enemies simple when they were far away. Elsa Reinhardt arrived in Briscoe County on a Thursday morning that smelled of dust and diesel. The transport truck carried 6 women wearing the plain gray work uniforms issued to prisoners assigned to agricultural labor. They stepped down one by one into the bright Texas sun, blinking slightly as if the sky itself had surprised them. Elsa was the third to step onto the gravel. She moved carefully, not timidly, but with the steady awareness of someone who had learned to notice small details. The angle of the truck ramp, the loose stones under her boots, the way the guard standing nearby shifted his weight every few seconds. Her hair was pulled back in a simple knot, practical for work, and she carried nothing except a folded cloth bag containing the few items prisoners were allowed to keep. From a distance, she looked like any other farm worker arriving for a long day in the fields. Up close there was something else in her posture. Not defiance. Something quieter. A kind of composure that did not depend on permission. Deputy Frank Pritchard watched the new arrivals from beside the sheriff's cruiser parked near the gate. Frank was the sort of man who believed the world stayed orderly only because someone was always watching for trouble. He nudged his hat higher on his head and said under his breath, "Never thought we'd be importing Germans to pick Texas cotton." Nolan stood beside him, hands resting lightly on his belt. "They're prisoners assigned to labor," Nolan replied calmly. "Same rules as the others." Frank grunted. "Still feels strange." Nolan didn't answer. His eyes were on Elsa, though at the time he couldn't have explained why. She had already crouched beside one of the other women who had caught her sleeve on a splinter of wood while stepping down from the truck. Elsa freed the cloth gently and checked the tear with the quick efficiency of someone accustomed to fixing small problems before they became larger ones. No fuss, no complaint, just a quiet solution and a nod that said the moment had passed. Sheriff Briggs had seen hundreds of people move through this county during his years wearing the badge. Farmers, drifters, soldiers on leave, traveling salesmen who carried suitcases full of tools or watches. Most people revealed something about themselves within the first 30 seconds of being observed. Fear, anger, pride. Elsa Reinhardt revealed almost nothing except attention. She looked at the land around her the way a careful reader studies a page. The cotton fields stretched toward the horizon in long pale rows broken only by windmills and scattered barns. Heat rose from the dirt road in wavering ribbons. Somewhere nearby a dog barked lazily. Elsa noticed all of it without appearing to stare. Deputy Frank spat into the dust and leaned closer to Nolan. "You ever think about what they were doing before they got here?" he asked quietly. Nolan's answer came after a moment. "Every person in this country was doing something before the war," he said. "Most of it had nothing to do with the war." Frank shook his head. "Still Germans." Nolan watched Elsa help the other woman smooth the torn sleeve before both prisoners were guided toward the waiting farm truck that would take them to their assigned fields. "Still people," Nolan said. The workday began the way most workdays did in Briscoe County. Early, hot, and mostly silent. By noon the temperature had climbed past 90 degrees, and the sky had settled into that wide pale blue that seemed to belong only to Texas. Sheriff Briggs spent the morning in his office finishing routine reports while the ceiling fan turned slowly above his desk. Outside the window, Main Street carried the lazy rhythm of a town that understood patience. A delivery truck rumbled past the hardware store. Mrs. Calder from the bakery walked across the street carrying a box of pies balanced carefully in both hands. Nothing in the scene suggested that somewhere beyond the cotton fields a decision had already begun forming that would soon attract the attention of men whose offices stood 1,000 miles away in Washington. Decisions rarely announced themselves when they were beginning. They simply arrived quietly, like a ring in a coat pocket or a name written beside another name on a line meant for signatures. And by the time anyone realized what had happened, the question was no longer whether the decision existed. The question was who intended to challenge it. The afternoon sun settled over Briscoe County with the steady weight of late summer, the kind of heat that slowed even the windmills until their blades turned like tired hands pointing toward the sky, and beyond the last row of cotton the farm truck rattled to a stop, while 6 German prisoners climbed down into fields that stretched for nearly half a mile in either direction. Pale green plants standing in long patient lines that had been planted months earlier by men who were now fighting somewhere across an ocean. Elsa Reinhardt stepped onto the dry soil and paused for half a second, not long enough for anyone to call it hesitation, only long enough for her eyes to measure the distance between rows, the slope of the ground, the direction of the sun. A farm foreman named Harold Sutton wiped his forehead with a red handkerchief and pointed toward the open rows. "You pick clean," he said slowly, speaking the way Americans sometimes spoke to foreigners even when they suspected the person understood every word. "Fill the sacks. Water barrel is under the oak tree about 50 yards that way." Elsa nodded once. The other women followed her into the field, canvas sacks slung over their shoulders, the quiet rustle of cotton leaves mixing with the faraway hum of a tractor somewhere beyond the hill. Work began the way work always begins, with hands learning a rhythm before the mind decides whether it approves. Cotton bolls snapped softly between fingers. The sacks grew heavier inch by inch. The sun climbed higher until the shadows under the plants shrank into thin gray shapes. Elsa moved steadily, neither the fastest nor the slowest among the women. But there was something about the way she worked that suggested attention rather than effort. She noticed when a branch bent awkwardly and shifted the plant so the boll would not tear. She noticed when the canvas strap of another worker's sack twisted against her shoulder and quietly straightened it without interrupting the pace of the row. By mid-morning the heat had climbed past 90 degrees, and the air carried the dry smell of cotton fiber and dust. Harold Sutton walked the rows once with a clipboard, marking rough tallies of filled sacks. He paused when he reached Elsa's row. "You worked farms before?" he asked. Elsa shook her head gently. "No farms," she said in careful English. "But plants grow the same everywhere." Harold studied her for a moment, then nodded once as if that answer made a kind of practical sense. He moved on without another word. Near noon the sound of a truck engine drifted across the fields, slow and familiar. Sheriff Nolan Briggs drove along the narrow dirt road that bordered the farm, his cruiser kicking up a thin trail of dust that hung in the still air long after the tires stopped moving. Nolan stepped out and rested his forearms against the wooden fence while he looked across the rows. It was a habit more than an inspection. The sheriff had learned that a quiet presence often prevented problems before they had time to grow. Deputy Frank Pritchard climbed out of the passenger side and shaded his eyes. Hard to believe they crossed an ocean to end up picking cotton in Texas, he muttered. Nolan did not answer right away. He watched the workers move between the rows in slow, steady lines. From this distance, they were only shapes shifting through green leaves and sunlight. But one shape moved differently. Elsa had knelt beside a younger prisoner whose sack had slipped from her shoulder and spilled half its cotton onto the ground. Instead of calling for help, Elsa gathered the scattered bowls with calm efficiency, brushing dust from each one before dropping it back into the sack, as if the cotton itself deserved respect. Frank followed Nolan's gaze. "You watching that one again?" he said quietly. Nolan pushed his hat back a fraction. "I watch everyone." Frank shrugged. "Looks like she knows what she is doing." Nolan said nothing, but he noticed the same thing Harold Sutton had noticed earlier. Elsa worked with the same measured calm she had shown when stepping down from the transport truck. No wasted motion. No visible frustration. Just a steady attention that made the long hours seem smaller than they were. By noon the sun had settled directly overhead, and Harold Sutton called for a break. The women carried their sacks to the shade of the oak tree, where a wooden barrel of water stood beside a row of tin cups. The tree cast a wide circle of shadow across the dry ground, and the workers sat carefully along the roots while the breeze stirred the leaves overhead. Elsa filled a cup and drank slowly. Across the field, Nolan Briggs remained leaning against the fence, the brim of his hat casting a shadow across his eyes. Deputy Frank had already returned to the cruiser to check the radio, leaving the sheriff alone with the quiet view of the farm. A moment later, Elsa stood and walked toward the fence carrying the empty cup. She stopped a few feet away, leaving the proper distance that rules and customs both required. Nolan tipped his hat slightly in acknowledgement. "Hot day," he said. Elsa glanced at the sky as if confirming the obvious. "Texas is generous with the sun," she replied. Nolan allowed a small smile that appeared and disappeared almost immediately. "You speak English well." Elsa shrugged gently. "My father believed languages were useful tools," she said. "He said a person who understands more words understands more people." Nolan considered that for a moment. "Your father a teacher?" Elsa shook her head. "A watchmaker." She turned the tin cup in her hands while the sunlight flashed along its rim. "Small machines," she continued. "They only work when every piece keeps its place." Nolan looked out across the cotton rows again. "That sounds like a good description of most things." Elsa nodded once and returned the cup to the barrel before walking back toward the shade of the oak tree. Nolan watched her cross the short stretch of dirt between the fence and the workers. It was not curiosity that held his attention. It was something quieter, the same feeling a person might have when noticing a detail in a familiar room that had somehow been overlooked for years. Deputy Frank returned from the cruiser carrying a folded newspaper. "You hear about this?" he asked, handing it over. Nolan unfolded the page. The headline spoke about labor shortages across the country and the growing use of prisoner work programs to keep farms operating. Government language filled most of the column, careful and practical. Nolan folded the paper again. "Country has to keep moving," he said. Frank leaned against the fence beside him. "Still feels strange," he said again, repeating the words from earlier that morning. Nolan watched Elsa settle back beneath the oak tree while the other workers spoke quietly around her. "Strange does not always mean wrong," he said. Frank studied the field with narrowed eyes, but did not argue. A few minutes later, Harold Sutton called the workers back to the rows, and the quiet rhythm of cotton picking resumed beneath the wide Texas sky. The sheriff remained by the fence a little longer than he needed to, listening to the soft snapping of cotton bolls in the distance and the slow turning of the windmill above the barn. Somewhere far beyond the fields, a train horn sounded again, long and low, the same distant note that had drifted through the town 2 nights earlier when Nolan stood outside the church holding a ring he had not yet decided to use. The afternoon moved slowly across Briscoe County the way summer afternoons often did, stretching each hour until the sun seemed reluctant to move and every shadow settled patiently beneath the cotton plants. And by the time the work whistle sounded at 4 o'clock, the sacks stacked beside the wagon had grown into a pale mountain of fiber that would soon travel to a mill somewhere far from Texas soil. Elsa Reinhardt wiped her hands on the cloth bag she carried and stepped away from the rows with the same calm pace she had shown since morning. The workers climbed into the back of the farm truck one by one, boots tapping softly against the wooden boards as the engine coughed to life again. Sheriff Nolan Briggs was still parked along the fence line when the truck passed the road. The dust rose slowly behind it, drifting through the hot air like thin smoke. Deputy Frank Pritchard leaned against the cruiser door and folded his arms. "They worked steady," he said. Nolan nodded once. "Looks that way." Frank watched the truck disappear around the bend toward the main highway that led back to Camp Ashford. "You ever think about what happens to them after this is over?" Frank asked. Nolan kept his eyes on the road where the dust was settling again. "After the war?" Frank shrugged. "After everything." Nolan considered the question longer than Frank expected. "Most people go back to wherever they started," he said quietly. "If that place still exists." Frank let out a breath through his nose. Strange world. Nolan did not argue with that. The sheriff returned to town as the sun lowered toward the western edge of the county, turning the sky into wide bands of amber and soft blue that stretched across miles of open land. Main Street carried the slow rhythm of evening. A delivery boy pedaled past the diner with a crate of milk bottles rattling behind his bicycle. The hardware store owner swept dust from the wooden sidewalk with long, patient strokes. Nolan parked in front of the sheriff's office and stepped inside where the ceiling fan turned steadily above the desk. The small room smelled faintly of paper and coffee. A stack of routine forms waited beside the typewriter, each one requiring the same careful lines of handwriting Nolan had practiced since his first year wearing the badge. He finished 2 reports before the front door creaked open. Deputy Frank stepped inside, holding another newspaper folded beneath his arm. "News from Washington again," Frank said. Nolan looked up from the desk. "Anything important?" Frank shrugged as he placed the paper down. "Just more talk about labor programs and production numbers." Nolan glanced at the headline but did not read the full article. He had learned that national news often arrived in Briscoe County like weather from another state, noticeable but distant. The sheriff finished the last line on the report and set his pen down. The evening air drifting through the open window carried the sound of a train horn somewhere beyond town. It was the same long, low note that had echoed across the fields earlier that day. Nolan stood and walked to the window for a moment, watching the light fade slowly across the empty street. The town looked peaceful in that hour between work and supper when most people returned home and the sidewalks fell quiet. Across the street, the diner sign flickered on with a soft electric hum. Nolan stepped outside and crossed the street, pushing open the glass door as the bell above it rang once. The smell of coffee and grilled bread filled the room. 2 farmers sat near the counter speaking in low voices about weather and crop prices. Nolan took his usual seat near the end of the counter and nodded to Mrs. Calder behind the register. "Evening, Sheriff," she said warmly. "Coffee?" Nolan nodded. "Yes, ma'am." She poured a fresh cup and slid it across the counter. Nolan wrapped his hands around the warm ceramic mug while the ceiling fan above stirred the air slowly. A few minutes passed before the diner door opened again. Nolan glanced up automatically, expecting another farmer or traveler from the highway. Instead, the camp transport truck rolled past the diner window, on its way back toward Camp Ashford. The prisoners sat quietly in the back, silhouettes against the fading light. Elsa Reinhardt turned her head slightly as the truck passed the diner window. For a brief moment, her eyes met Nolan's through the glass. It was not a long look, only a second perhaps, but it was long enough for Nolan to notice something that had not been there earlier in the day. Not fear, not curiosity, recognition. The truck continued down the road and disappeared beyond the courthouse square. Nolan took a slow sip of coffee while the bell above the diner door settled back into silence. Mrs. Calder wiped the counter with a cloth and glanced toward the window. "Those prisoners come through town every evening now," she said. Nolan nodded slightly. "They are part of the farm program." She leaned closer. "Strange times," she said quietly. Nolan gave the same answer he had given Frank earlier. "The world is moving in ways we did not expect." Outside, the sky deepened into a soft violet color as the first stars appeared above the rooftops. Nolan finished his coffee and stepped back onto the sidewalk where the evening breeze carried the faint smell of cotton fields from beyond town. He stood there for a moment watching the courthouse clock tick toward 8 o'clock. The town had grown quiet again. Lights glowed warmly behind the windows of nearby houses where families gathered for supper and conversation. Nolan adjusted his hat and started back toward the sheriff's office, but he paused halfway across the street. In the distance along the road that led toward Camp Ashford, a small group of figures walked beside the fence line under the fading light. Prisoners returning from the fields sometimes walked short distances before the evening count. Nolan recognized the calm, steady stride immediately. Elsa Reinhardt walked slightly apart from the others, carrying the same cloth bag she had held that morning. As she passed the edge of the courthouse square, she slowed for a moment and looked toward the building with the quiet attention Nolan had noticed earlier in the day. It was the kind of look someone gives a place they are trying to understand rather than judge. Nolan remained standing in the street while the figures continued down the road. The courthouse clock struck 8 with a clear, measured sound that echoed across the empty square. When the last note faded, the road was empty again. Nolan turned back toward the office, but the feeling that had followed him since morning remained, quiet and persistent, like the distant sound of that train horn moving slowly through the night beyond Briscoe County. The next morning arrived quietly over Briscoe County, the kind of morning that began with pale light spreading slowly across the cotton fields while the air still carried a trace of coolness before the Texas sun claimed the sky again. Sheriff Nolan Briggs stepped out of the small house he rented near the edge of town just after 6 o'clock, a tin coffee cup in one hand and his hat tucked beneath the other arm. The street was empty except for a delivery truck parked near the bakery where Mrs. Calder was already beginning her day. Nolan stood for a moment on the wooden porch, listening to the distant sounds of the county waking up. A rooster called somewhere beyond the barns. The courthouse clock struck the hour with a steady mechanical rhythm. Another day beginning the same way the last one had ended, quietly and without announcement. He finished the coffee and walked toward the sheriff's office, boots tapping softly against the sidewalk boards. Inside the office, the air still held the faint smell of paper and yesterday's coffee. Nolan hung his hat on the rack beside the door and opened the window to let the morning breeze move through the room. A few minutes later, Deputy Frank Pritchard pushed the door open and stepped inside with his usual quick stride. "Morning," Frank said while setting his hat on the desk. Nolan nodded. "Morning." Frank poured himself a cup from the pot that had been left on the warmer and leaned against the edge of the desk. "Farm trucks already moving," he said. "Past one on the road near Miller's property." Nolan looked out the open window toward the highway that led past the courthouse square. "Cotton does not wait," he replied calmly. Frank took a sip of coffee and studied the street outside. "You going out there again today?" he asked. Nolan shrugged slightly. "Maybe." Frank gave a quiet laugh. "You never used to visit the fields this often." Nolan did not answer immediately. Instead, he picked up the morning report from the desk and skimmed the lines slowly before setting it back down. "Part of the county. Now," he said simply. Frank nodded but watched him with the same careful curiosity he had shown the day before. Outside the window, the sound of an approaching truck engine drifted into town. Nolan stepped onto the sidewalk just in time to see the farm transport vehicle roll through the square on its way toward the northern fields. The prisoners sat quietly in the back again, their shapes outlined by the rising sun behind them. Elsa Reinhardt sat near the side rail with the cloth bag resting beside her knee. She turned her head slightly when the truck passed the sheriff's office, the movement small but deliberate. Nolan lifted his hand in a brief nod. Elsa returned the gesture with the same quiet acknowledgement she had given him beside the oak tree the previous afternoon. The truck continued past the courthouse and disappeared along the road that led toward the fields. Frank stepped outside beside Nolan and watched the dust settle behind it. "You see that?" he asked. Nolan kept his eyes on the empty road. "See what?" Frank tilted his head toward the distance. "That woman notices everything." Nolan adjusted the brim of his hat. "Some people pay attention to the world around them." Frank gave a short breath that might have been agreement or doubt. "Still strange," he said again, repeating the phrase that had followed him since the prisoners arrived. The morning passed with the usual routine of small-town law work. Nolan checked a fence dispute near the edge of the county, signed a delivery permit for a truck carrying farm equipment, and answered a call from the post office about a missing parcel that turned out to be sitting on the wrong shelf. By late morning, the temperature had already climbed toward 85 degrees, and the sky had settled into a clear, open blue. Nolan found himself driving toward the same farm road again before he had fully decided to do so. The cruiser rolled slowly along the dirt path until the cotton rows appeared ahead, stretching across the land like lines drawn carefully across a page. The workers were already in the field when Nolan stepped out beside the fence. Harold Sutton raised a hand in greeting from near the wagon. "Morning, Sheriff," he called. Nolan returned the gesture. "Everything going smooth?" Harold nodded. "Best crew we have had this season." Nolan leaned against the fence rail and looked across the rows. The workers moved steadily beneath the bright sky, sacks dragging lightly against the plants as the cotton bolls disappeared into the canvas. Elsa Reinhardt was halfway down one of the middle rows. She paused briefly to straighten a plant that had bent sideways before continuing forward again. The motion was small, almost invisible from a distance, but Nolan noticed it immediately. After a few minutes, Harold walked over and rested his arms on the fence beside him. "That one there," he said quietly while nodding toward Elsa. "She notices things other people miss." Nolan watched the row in silence. "So it seems." Harold wiped his forehead with the red handkerchief he always carried. "Used to think prisoners would only do the minimum," he continued. "But that one works like the plants matter." Nolan nodded slowly. "Some people carry their habits with them wherever they go." Harold glanced toward the rows again. "You ever ask where she learned English?" Nolan shook his head. "Her father was a watchmaker." Harold raised his eyebrows slightly. "Well, that explains it." Nolan looked at him with mild curiosity. Harold shrugged. "People who build watches spend their lives paying attention to details." The two men stood quietly for a moment while the breeze moved gently across the field. Somewhere beyond the barns, the windmill creaked as it turned slowly above the water tank. After the noon whistle sounded, the workers gathered again beneath the oak tree where the barrel of water waited in the shade. Elsa filled a cup and drank before noticing Nolan standing by the fence. She walked the same short distance across the dirt path and stopped a respectful few feet away. Nolan tipped his hat again. "Looks like the heat arrived early today," he said. Elsa glanced at the clear sky. "Texas is consistent." Nolan allowed another small smile. "You getting used to the work?" Elsa held the empty tin cup loosely in her hands. "Work is simple," she replied. "It is the waiting that is difficult." Nolan studied her expression. "Waiting for what?" Elsa considered the question for a moment. "For the world to decide what comes next." Nolan looked across the fields where the cotton rows stretched toward the distant road. "Most people are waiting for that right now," he said quietly. Elsa nodded once and returned the cup to the barrel before walking back toward the shade where the others sat. Nolan remained by the fence a little longer while the afternoon sun continued its slow climb across the sky. Somewhere far beyond the fields, the faint sound of a train horn drifted through the warm air again. The same distant note that seemed to follow the quiet decisions people made before they understood how much those decisions would matter. By the third morning, the rhythm of the county had settled into something that no one officially described, but everyone quietly recognized. The farm trucks arrived at nearly the same minute each day. The cotton rows waited beneath the wide sky. The courthouse clock marked the hours with steady certainty. And Sheriff Nolan Briggs found himself standing beside the same stretch of fence once again as the workers moved slowly between the plants beneath the Texas sun. The air carried the dry smell of dust and cotton fiber. Somewhere beyond the barns, a windmill turned with a slow metallic creak that sounded almost like a tired voice repeating the same sentence again and again. Nolan rested his forearms on the fence rail and watched the rows with the calm patience of a man who had learned that understanding people rarely came from asking questions too quickly. Harold Sutton approached after a few minutes, his boots leaving soft prints in the loose soil. He leaned against the fence beside Nolan and followed the sheriff's gaze toward the middle rows. "She noticed the irrigation line this morning before anyone else did," Harold said quietly. Nolan glanced toward him. "Problem with it?" Harold shook his head. "Not yet. But the pipe was beginning to loosen near the pump house. Another day or two, and we might have lost half the pressure in the line." Nolan looked back toward the rows where Elsa Reinhardt worked steadily among the plants. "And she told you?" Harold gave a small nod. "She did not make a fuss about it. Just walked over and said the soil near the pipe looked different from the rest. Turned out she was right." Nolan watched her a moment longer. Elsa had paused beside one of the younger workers again, adjusting the strap of the canvas sack so it would rest more comfortably on the woman's shoulder. The motion was quiet and efficient, finished before anyone nearby seemed to notice. Harold wiped his forehead with his red handkerchief. "Some people carry order with them," he said. Nolan considered the words. "Watchmakers probably learned that early," he replied. Harold chuckled softly. Guess so. The sun climbed higher, and the morning stretched toward noon with the slow patience of rural work. The cotton plants rustled gently whenever the breeze moved across the field. The sound was soft enough that it blended with the distant hum of tractors working another farm across the county road. Nolan remained by the fence longer than usual that day. Not because there was trouble. Briscoe County rarely produced the kind of trouble that required urgency. Instead, the sheriff watched the quiet patterns forming across the rows, the way each worker developed a pace that matched the land itself. Elsa moved steadily along her row, her attention shifting from plant to plant as if each one deserved its own moment of care. Deputy Frank Pritchard arrived shortly before noon, his cruiser rolling to a stop beside Nolan's truck. Frank stepped out and leaned against the hood while adjusting the brim of his hat. "You are becoming a regular visitor out here," he said with a faint smile that carried both humor and curiosity. Nolan nodded slightly. "Part of the county." Frank followed his gaze across the field. "Harold says the crew works better when you show up," he said. Nolan shrugged. "People usually work the same whether someone is watching or not." Frank gave a quiet breath. "Maybe, but they know you are watching." The noon whistle sounded a few minutes later, a clear metal note that drifted across the field like a signal from another time. The workers gathered beneath the oak tree again where the shade spread across the dry soil. Tin cups clinked softly against the water barrel as the prisoners filled them one by one. Nolan remained near the fence while Harold walked toward the wagon to check the sacks. After a moment, Elsa stood and crossed the short distance toward the road, carrying her empty cup the same way she had the day before. She stopped a few feet from the fence and nodded politely. Nolan returned the gesture. "You are adjusting to Texas," he said. Elsa looked toward the wide horizon where the cotton rows faded into pale green distance. "Texas is very large," she replied calmly. "It gives a person time to think." Nolan allowed a faint smile. "That can be useful." Elsa turned the tin cup slowly in her hands. "In Germany, my father repaired watches at a small table near the window," she said after a moment. "Every morning, he wound the clocks before opening the shop. He said the world works better when people keep track of time." Nolan listened quietly. "And now?" he asked. Elsa glanced toward the courthouse tower that rose faintly above the distant buildings of town. "Now time feels different," she said. "Days move slowly, but decisions move quickly." Nolan leaned slightly against the fence rail. "Decisions about the war?" Elsa shook her head gently. "About people." The breeze shifted across the field again, carrying the smell of cotton and dry earth through the shade of the oak tree. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Nolan watched the workers resting in the shade while the distant windmill turned slowly against the sky. "Most decisions are smaller than people think," he said finally. Elsa considered the thought. "Small decisions change large things," she replied. Nolan nodded once, recognizing the quiet certainty in her voice. Elsa returned the tin cup to the barrel and walked back toward the shade where the others waited for the whistle to signal the end of the break. Nolan remained by the fence while the afternoon work resumed. The rows slowly filled with movement again as the workers continued along their steady lines. Deputy Frank stood beside the cruiser with his arms folded. "You talk with her often now," he said after a while. Nolan looked toward the field. "Only when she walks over." Frank studied the sheriff's expression for a moment. "People in town will notice," he said carefully. Nolan adjusted his hat slightly against the sunlight. "People always notice something." Frank nodded but did not argue. The afternoon stretched toward evening while the sky slowly deepened into the warm colors that came before sunset. Nolan eventually stepped away from the fence and walked back toward his truck. Before climbing inside, he looked once more across the cotton rows. Elsa Reinhardt had reached the far end of her line and paused briefly to straighten another plant that leaned too far toward the soil. The movement was small and almost invisible from a distance, but Nolan recognized it instantly. Some people carried order with them wherever they went, and sometimes the quiet order of one person could begin to shift the direction of another person's day in ways that no report or regulation had ever predicted. As Nolan started the truck and drove slowly back toward the road leading to town, the distant sound of a train horn drifted again across the evening air, long and steady, echoing through the wide, open fields of Briscoe County, as if reminding the land itself that somewhere far beyond the horizon, the larger world was still moving forward. The following morning began with a thin layer of mist stretching low across the cotton fields, a rare softness in the air before the Texas heat rose again to claim the day. Sheriff Nolan Briggs had been awake since before sunrise, sitting quietly at the small kitchen table in his rented house, with a cup of black coffee resting between his hands. The window beside him faced east toward the open land beyond town, and the early light moved slowly across the wooden floor as the courthouse clock somewhere in the distance marked the hour with a steady mechanical tone. Nolan had lived in Briscoe County long enough to recognize the difference between noise and change. Noise came and went. Change arrived quietly, usually disguised as something ordinary. The farm trucks began moving along the county roads just after 6 o'clock, their engines carrying across the open land before the vehicles themselves appeared. Nolan finished the last of his coffee and stepped outside, placing his hat firmly against the morning breeze before walking toward the sheriff's office. Main Street had only just begun to wake. A bakery delivery truck rattled past the courthouse square while Mrs. Calder opened the diner door and switched on the lights inside. Nolan unlocked the office and stepped into the familiar stillness of the room. Papers rested in neat stacks across the desk. The ceiling fan began its slow rotation with a soft electric hum when he flipped the switch on the wall. For a few minutes, he worked through routine reports from the previous day, signing his name with the same steady handwriting he had practiced for years. At 7:30 the door opened and Deputy Frank Pritchard stepped inside with the energy of someone who had already been awake longer than he intended. "Morning," Frank said while removing his hat. Nolan looked up briefly. "Morning." Frank poured coffee from the pot and leaned against the desk as he drank. "Transport truck already headed toward Miller's farm," he said. Nolan nodded without looking up from the report. "Harvest does not slow down for weather." Frank studied him for a moment before speaking again. "You planning another drive out there?" Nolan set the pen down. "Probably." Frank gave a short breath that might have been a quiet laugh. "You are becoming part of their routine." Nolan lifted his hat from the desk and stepped toward the door. Routine keeps people honest. The drive to the farm road took 15 minutes along a stretch of highway bordered by cotton fields and wooden fences that ran straight toward the horizon. The morning mist had begun to lift by the time Nolan reached the fence line where he usually stopped. The workers were already in the rows, their shapes moving steadily beneath the pale sky as the first heat of the day settled over the land. Harold Sutton raised a hand from near the wagon when he noticed the sheriff's truck. Nolan returned the greeting before leaning against the fence rail again. From this distance the cotton plants formed a wide sea of pale green stretching nearly half a mile across the field. The workers moved slowly through it like quiet currents. Elsa Reinhardt worked in the middle rows again, her canvas sack resting against her shoulder while her hands moved with the same measured pace Nolan had come to recognize. She paused occasionally to straighten a plant or brush dust away from a cotton boll before placing it carefully into the sack. Harold approached after a few minutes and rested his arms on the fence beside Nolan. "She caught another problem this morning," Harold said quietly. Nolan glanced toward him. "What kind of problem?" Harold nodded toward the far edge of the field. One of the younger workers nearly fainted from the heat earlier. Elsa noticed before anyone else did. Nolan followed his gaze across the rows. "And?" Harold shrugged slightly. "She walked her to the shade, had her drink water slowly, then sat with her until the dizziness passed." Nolan nodded once. "Sounds like good sense." Harold smiled faintly. "Better than good sense. Calm." The sheriff watched Elsa for a moment longer before speaking. "Some people carry calm with them." Harold wiped his forehead with the red handkerchief that never seemed far from reach. "Wish more people did." The sun climbed higher through the morning, and the air grew warmer by the minute. The cotton leaves rustled softly whenever the breeze crossed the field. Nolan remained near the fence longer than usual, occasionally speaking with Harold while the work continued across the rows. By the time the noon whistle echoed across the land, the temperature had already climbed past 90 degrees. The workers gathered beneath the wide oak tree again where the shade spread across the dusty ground. Tin cups tapped gently against the wooden barrel as each person filled them with water. Nolan remained by the fence while Harold checked the sacks beside the wagon. After a moment, Elsa stood and walked toward the road with the empty cup resting in her hands. She stopped a few feet from the fence and nodded politely as she had each day before. Nolan tipped his hat. "The heat arrived early today," he said. Elsa glanced toward the bright sky where the sun rested almost directly overhead. Texas does not wait for comfort, she replied. Nolan allowed a faint smile at that. You seem to be adjusting. Elsa turned the cup slowly in her hands. Adjustment is necessary, she said. But understanding takes longer. Nolan looked across the rows where the workers rested beneath the oak tree. Understanding what? Elsa considered the question carefully. Why people choose certain paths when other paths exist. Nolan rested his arms against the fence rail. Most people believe they are following the right path. Elsa nodded once. Yes, that is usually true. The breeze moved across the field again, stirring the leaves of the oak tree and carrying the faint scent of dust and cotton through the warm air. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Nolan studied the horizon where the distant barns and windmills stood against the pale sky. You think about the future often? He asked finally. Elsa looked toward the courthouse tower barely visible above the distant town buildings. In war, the future becomes a very quiet place, she said softly. Nolan watched her expression. Quiet can be useful. Elsa met his gaze for a moment before returning the cup to the barrel. Sometimes quiet decisions change everything, she replied. She nodded politely and walked back toward the shade where the others waited for the whistle to signal the end of the break. Nolan remained by the fence while the workers returned to their rows. The afternoon sun began its slow movement across the sky while the cotton plants rustled gently in the breeze. Deputy Frank arrived shortly after the break ended and stepped out beside the cruiser. He followed Nolan's gaze toward the rows. You ever notice how she walks? Frank asked quietly. Nolan looked toward the field. How do you mean? Frank folded his arms against the hood of the car. Like she already knows where she is going. Nolan watched Elsa move steadily along her row as the sack grew heavier against her shoulder. Maybe she does, he said. The afternoon stretched slowly toward evening while the quiet rhythm of the fields continued under the wide Texas sky. And somewhere far beyond the horizon, the distant sound of a train horn carried across the open land once more, long and steady, as if the larger world was slowly moving toward a moment that no one in Briscoe County had fully imagined yet. The next few days unfolded with the quiet consistency that Briscoe County understood better than most places in the country. Summer mornings arrived pale and cool before the sun climbed high enough to press heat against the fields. The courthouse clock marked each hour with the same steady rhythm. Farm trucks rolled past the square before 7 o'clock, carrying workers toward the cotton rows that stretched across the land like carefully drawn lines. Sheriff Nolan Briggs began noticing something during those mornings that he had not expected. It was not a sudden change, and it was not loud enough for most people to notice. It was simply a pattern forming the way small currents form in a river before anyone calls it a direction. Elsa Reinhardt had become part of the landscape of those fields, not because she spoke often. In fact, she spoke very little. But her presence carried the same steady order that Harold Sutton had mentioned days earlier. When something was out of place, she noticed. When another worker struggled with the heat, she slowed her pace and helped quietly without drawing attention to it. When a plant bent too far under the weight of cotton, she straightened it before moving on to the next row. Nolan began arriving at the fence line earlier than before, sometimes just after the workers stepped down from the truck. The sun would still be low enough that the cotton plants cast long shadows across the soil. From that distance, the entire field looked calm and predictable. But Nolan had spent enough years watching people to know that calm often hid the moments when decisions were quietly forming. One morning, Harold Sutton approached him again while adjusting the brim of his worn straw hat. You see what she did yesterday afternoon? Harold asked. Nolan leaned against the fence rail. What happened? Harold nodded toward the far side of the field where the irrigation pump stood beside a small wooden shed. The pump belt had begun slipping, he explained. Not enough to stop the water yet, but enough that we would have noticed it tomorrow. Nolan looked across the field toward the shed. And she noticed? Harold smiled slightly. She did not say anything dramatic about it. She just walked over and asked if the pump normally made that sound. Nolan considered that. What kind of sound? Harold chuckled softly. A softer rhythm, like the belt was skipping a tooth. Nolan watched Elsa working near the middle rows, her hands moving steadily among the cotton plants. Watchmakers listen for that kind of thing, he said quietly. Harold nodded. That is exactly what I thought. The days continued like that, one after another, each one carrying the same quiet rhythm that had begun shaping itself across the county. Nolan still performed his usual duties around town. He settled disputes between neighboring farmers about fence lines. He helped a traveling family whose truck had broken down near the highway. He signed routine paperwork at the courthouse. But the farm road had become a regular stop in the middle of those duties. Deputy Frank Pritchard began noticing the pattern more clearly with each passing day. One afternoon, as they stood beside the cruiser watching the cotton rows, Frank folded his arms and spoke carefully. "You ever think about how this looks?" he asked. Nolan kept his eyes on the field. "How what looks?" Frank nodded toward Elsa's row. "You coming out here every day?" Nolan rested his forearms on the fence rail. "Part of the county." Frank shook his head slowly. "You said that before." Nolan turned his head slightly. "It is still true." Frank watched the workers moving quietly through the plants. "People in town are already talking," he said. Nolan did not react immediately. The breeze moved gently across the field, rustling the cotton leaves with a sound like soft paper. "People in town talk about everything," Nolan replied calmly. Frank nodded but did not look convinced. The noon whistle echoed across the field a few minutes later. The workers gathered beneath the oak tree again, the same routine that had repeated itself day after day. Elsa filled a tin cup with water and drank slowly before setting the cup aside. As she had done several times before, she walked toward the road where Nolan stood near the fence. She stopped a few feet away and nodded politely. Nolan tipped his hat in return. "Looks like the heat might reach 95 today," he said. Elsa glanced toward the sky where the sun had already climbed high above the fields. "Texas measures time with temperature," she replied. Nolan allowed a faint smile at that. "You notice details most people ignore." Elsa held the empty tin cup loosely in both hands. "Details are where the truth usually hides," she said. Nolan studied her expression for a moment. "Your father taught you that?" Elsa nodded once. "He said a watch is not really a machine. It is a conversation between many small parts." Nolan considered the thought. "And if one part stops listening?" Elsa looked toward the windmill turning slowly above the distant barn. "Then the time becomes wrong," she said. The breeze moved through the oak tree leaves above them, scattering small patches of sunlight across the dusty ground. For a moment neither of them spoke. Nolan finally asked the question that had been forming quietly in his mind over the past week. "Do you miss your home?" Elsa did not answer immediately. She watched the horizon where the cotton rows faded into pale distance. "Home is a complicated word during a war," she said softly. Nolan nodded once. "I suppose it is." Elsa turned her attention back toward the workers resting beneath the tree. "Sometimes a person must decide where the future might exist," she continued. Nolan rested his hands against the fence rail again. "You think about that often?" Elsa met his gaze briefly. "Everyone thinks about the future," she replied. "But not everyone chooses it." The whistle sounded again to signal the end of the break. Elsa placed the tin cup back beside the barrel and nodded politely before walking back toward the rows. Nolan remained by the fence while the workers returned to their steady rhythm across the field. Deputy Frank stepped beside him a few minutes later and followed his gaze toward Elsa's row. "You know something?" Frank said quietly. Nolan did not look away from the field. "What is that?" Frank watched the workers move through the plants with slow, careful motion. "She walks like she belongs here." Nolan considered the words while the breeze crossed the cotton rows again. "Sometimes belonging is just a matter of time," he said. The afternoon stretched toward evening beneath the wide Texas sky. The cotton plants rustled gently as the workers continued along their rows. And somewhere far beyond the horizon another train horn echoed faintly across the land, long and steady, like a quiet reminder that the larger world was slowly moving toward a moment that would soon reach even the quiet roads of Briscoe County. The next change arrived quietly, the way most important changes do in places like Briscoe County. It began with a morning that looked exactly like every other morning before it. The sky opened slowly over the cotton fields. The courthouse clock struck 7 with its steady mechanical rhythm. Farm trucks rolled down the same dusty roads carrying workers toward the same endless rows of plants that had already filled so many long days beneath the Texas sun. Sheriff Nolan Briggs stood beside the familiar stretch of fence as he had done nearly every day that week, his forearms resting against the weathered rail while the breeze moved gently across the land. The cotton leaves rustled with a soft paper sound that had become part of the county's quiet language. But something about that morning carried a different weight. Not louder, not dramatic, just different. Harold Sutton noticed it first. The foreman approached Nolan with his usual slow stride, the red handkerchief already pressed against his forehead even though the sun had barely climbed above the horizon. "Sheriff," Harold said quietly. Nolan turned his head slightly. "Morning." Harold rested his arms on the fence beside him and looked out across the rows where the workers were beginning their steady progress through the plants. "Word came through town yesterday evening," Harold said. Nolan waited. Harold lowered his voice a little. "Camp Command wants to tighten supervision." Nolan's expression did not change, but his eyes moved briefly toward the dirt road that led back toward town. "Reason?" Harold shrugged. "War Department paperwork, they say. Somebody up the chain believes the prisoner work programs need closer watching." Nolan nodded once. "That happens from time to time." Harold glanced toward the middle rows where Elsa Reinhardt was already working with the same quiet rhythm she had shown since the first day. "Still," Harold continued, "it might change how things run around here." Nolan followed his gaze across the field. The workers moved slowly through the cotton plants while the morning sun climbed higher, spreading light across the rows like a thin sheet of gold. Elsa paused briefly to examine one of the plants before straightening it and continuing forward. From the distance, she looked like a small part of the landscape, another quiet motion among many. But Nolan had begun to understand that some quiet motions carried more meaning than others. Deputy Frank Pritchard arrived a few minutes later in the sheriff's cruiser, gravel crunching beneath the tires as he pulled beside Nolan's truck. Frank stepped out and leaned against the hood while adjusting his hat. "You hear the news?" he asked. Nolan nodded slightly. Harold mentioned it. Frank watched the field with narrowed eyes. "Army men might start showing up out here more often." Nolan rested his hands against the fence rail. "That is their job." Frank studied him carefully. "And ours," he added. The morning progressed slowly while the workers continued their steady pace through the rows. The sun climbed higher, and the air warmed quickly. By the time the noon whistle sounded, the temperature had already pushed past 90 degrees. The workers gathered beneath the oak tree once again, where the shade spread across the dusty ground. Tin cups tapped gently against the wooden water barrel while the breeze moved through the leaves above them. Elsa filled a cup and drank slowly before placing it beside the barrel. After a moment, she walked toward the road where Nolan stood near the fence. She stopped a few feet away and nodded politely. Nolan returned the gesture. "Looks like the day will be hotter than yesterday," he said. Elsa glanced toward the sky, where the sunlight had grown bright enough to blur the horizon. "Texas continues to keep its promises," she replied calmly. Nolan allowed a faint smile. "You notice that kind of thing?" Elsa held the tin cup loosely between her hands. "Patterns are easy to see when a person watches carefully," she said. Nolan studied her expression for a moment. "You have noticed something today," he said quietly. Elsa looked toward the road that led back toward town. "There is tension in the air," she replied. Nolan nodded slowly. "News travels quickly." Elsa turned the cup once in her hands before placing it back beside the barrel. "News often arrives before understanding," she said. Nolan leaned slightly against the fence rail. "Sometimes understanding comes later." Elsa met his gaze briefly. "Sometimes it never comes." The breeze moved across the cotton rows again, carrying the faint smell of dust and dry leaves through the shade of the oak tree. For a moment, the entire field seemed to pause in that quiet space between one decision and the next. Nolan finally spoke. "Camp supervision may increase soon," he said. Elsa nodded gently as if she had already expected that answer. "War creates many rules," she said. Nolan looked toward the courthouse tower, faintly visible above the distant town buildings. "Rules are meant to keep order." Elsa glanced toward the rows where the other workers waited for the whistle that would signal the end of the break. "Order is useful," she said softly, "but sometimes it arrives too late." The whistle sounded again a moment later. Elsa nodded politely and returned to the field where the steady rhythm of work began once more beneath the wide Texas sky. Nolan remained by the fence while the rows slowly filled with motion again. Deputy Frank stepped beside him and watched the workers for a long moment. "Army men watching more closely," Frank said quietly. Nolan kept his eyes on the field. "That is their job." Frank nodded but continued studying Elsa's row as she moved steadily through the plants. "Still," he said after a pause, Changes have a way of reaching small towns eventually. Nolan adjusted the brim of his hat, while the afternoon sun continued its slow climb across the sky. Somewhere far beyond the fields, the faint sound of a train horn echoed across the open land once again, long and steady, as if reminding the quiet roads of Briscoe County that the larger world had begun turning its attention in their direction. The change that Harold had mentioned did not arrive with noise or urgency. It arrived with a government sedan rolling slowly into Briscoe County 3 mornings later, just after the courthouse clock struck 8. The car carried the dull black color of official vehicles and a thin layer of highway dust that suggested it had traveled a long distance before reaching the quiet square in front of the courthouse. Sheriff Nolan Briggs noticed it from the window of his office before the engine had even stopped running. He watched the driver step out carefully, adjusting the brim of a dark hat before glancing around the town, as if measuring the place against something written in a file somewhere far away. The man's posture carried the kind of quiet authority that did not need introduction. Nolan had seen it before in visiting inspectors and federal officers who occasionally passed through small counties during wartime. He closed the report he had been reading and stepped outside onto the wooden sidewalk. Deputy Frank Pritchard was already crossing the street from the diner with a cup of coffee in his hand. Frank followed Nolan's gaze toward the sedan. "Looks like the supervision Harold mentioned," Frank said quietly. Nolan nodded once. The stranger reached the sidewalk and walked toward them with steady steps. He was tall, neatly dressed in a gray suit despite the rising Texas heat, and he carried a small leather case tucked beneath one arm. When he stopped in front of Nolan, he removed his hat politely. "Sheriff Briggs," the man said. Nolan extended his hand calmly. "That is correct." The man shook his hand with a firm but measured grip. "Major Eugene Mercer," he said. "United States Army Intelligence." Frank took a slow sip of coffee beside them while watching carefully. Nolan gestured toward the office door. "What brings Army Intelligence to Briscoe County, Major?" Mercer replaced his hat and glanced briefly toward the quiet courthouse square before answering. "Routine observation," he said. "The War Department has been reviewing prisoner labor programs across several states." Nolan nodded as if the explanation matched what he had expected. "Cotton harvest is important this year." Mercer's expression remained calm. "Exactly." Inside the office, the ceiling fan turned slowly while the morning sunlight filtered through the window onto Nolan's desk. Mercer placed the leather case on the chair beside him and opened a small notebook. "Your county has maintained an efficient program," he said. Nolan leaned lightly against the desk. "Farmers here take their work seriously." Mercer wrote something in the notebook before looking up again. "I understand the prisoners worked several nearby fields, including the Sutton farm." Nolan nodded. "That is correct." Mercer closed the notebook for a moment and studied the sheriff's expression carefully. "I will be visiting the work sites this afternoon." Nolan met his gaze without hesitation. "You are welcome to." Deputy Frank stood near the window with his arms folded while the two men spoke. Frank recognized the careful tone in Mercer's voice. It was the tone of someone who had asked many questions in many places before arriving here. The morning passed quietly after Mercer left the office to visit the courthouse clerk and review a few routine documents. By early afternoon, the government sedan rolled slowly along the same dirt road that Nolan had driven so many times toward the cotton fields. Nolan followed behind in his own truck with Frank riding beside him. Neither man spoke much during the drive. The sky stretched wide and pale above the fields while the summer sun pressed heat across the open land. When they reached the fence line, Harold Sutton was already standing near the wagon, watching the workers move steadily through the rows. Mercer stepped from the sedan and removed his hat again while studying the field with careful attention. "Impressive operation," he said quietly. Harold nodded politely. "We try to keep things orderly." Mercer walked slowly toward the fence while Nolan joined him. From that vantage point, the cotton plants formed long pale lines stretching nearly half a mile across the field. Workers moved steadily between them, canvas sacks brushing softly against the leaves. Elsa Reinhardt worked near the middle rows again, her hands moving with the same calm rhythm that Nolan had come to recognize immediately. Mercer watched the field for several minutes without speaking. Finally, he asked a simple question. "Do the prisoners interact much with the town?" Nolan answered calmly. "Only as necessary for the work program." Mercer nodded slowly. "Good." Frank leaned against the cruiser while studying Mercer's expression. The major's eyes moved carefully across the rows as if cataloging every motion. When the noon whistle sounded, the workers gathered beneath the oak tree once again. Mercer continued watching while the prisoners filled their cups with water from the barrel. Elsa stood among them with the same quiet composure she carried in the field. After drinking, she placed the tin cup down and began walking toward the road where Nolan stood near the fence. Mercer noticed the movement immediately. "That one," he said quietly. Nolan followed his gaze without reacting. "What about her?" Mercer watched Elsa approach the fence with calm steps. "She appears to be comfortable here." Nolan nodded once. "She works well." Mercer did not respond immediately. Instead, he observed the short exchange between Elsa and Nolan as she stopped a respectful distance from the fence and nodded politely. Nolan tipped his hat in return. Their conversation lasted only a moment before Elsa returned to the shade of the oak tree. Mercer studied the scene carefully before speaking again. "You speak with her often?" Nolan answered without hesitation. "Occasionally when she walks over." Mercer nodded thoughtfully and looked back across the field where the workers soon returned to their rows. The afternoon sun settled heavily across the land while the cotton plants rustled softly in the breeze. Mercer closed his notebook and replaced it inside the leather case. "I will remain in the county for several days," he said calmly. Nolan adjusted the brim of his hat. "You are welcome here." Mercer glanced once more toward the middle rows where Elsa continued her steady work among the plants. "I am sure I will learn a great deal about this place," he replied. The breeze moved slowly across the field as the afternoon stretched toward evening beneath the wide Texas sky. And somewhere far beyond the cotton rows, the distant sound of a train horn echoed again across the open land, long and steady, as if the quiet world of Briscoe County had just begun attracting the attention of people whose decisions carried far beyond the horizon. Major Eugene Mercer did not rush his work. That became clear to everyone in Briscoe County by the second day of his visit. He arrived early, often before the courthouse clock struck 8, and spent long quiet minutes observing things that most people would have passed without notice. The government sedan appeared again outside the sheriff's office the next morning while the sun was still low over the cotton fields. Sheriff Nolan Briggs saw it from the window and already knew the day would move differently than the ones before it. Mercer stepped out of the vehicle with the same measured calm he had shown the day before, adjusting the cuffs of his gray jacket before walking across the street toward the office. The town looked the same as always. The diner door stood open to let the morning air inside. A delivery wagon rattled slowly past the courthouse steps. A pair of farmers spoke quietly beside the feed store. But Mercer looked at the town the way a watchmaker studies the gears inside a clock, noticing how each piece moved in relation to the others. Nolan opened the door before Mercer even knocked. "Major," he said calmly. Mercer removed his hat and stepped inside. "Sheriff Briggs." Deputy Frank Pritchard leaned against the desk while sipping his coffee, watching the visitor with careful attention. Mercer placed his leather case on the chair again and opened the notebook he had carried the day before. "I appreciate your cooperation yesterday," he said. Nolan nodded. "Nothing unusual about our operation." Mercer wrote a short note before speaking again. "That may be true, but routine observation sometimes reveals details people stop seeing." Frank gave a quiet breath that might have been a laugh. "You will find this county is not very mysterious." Mercer closed the notebook gently. "Every place has its own patterns." Nolan watched him for a moment before asking the question that had been forming quietly since the previous afternoon. "And what pattern are you looking for?" Mercer met his gaze calmly. "Consistency." The word lingered in the quiet office while the ceiling fan turned slowly above them. Outside, the courthouse clock struck 9 with a steady metallic tone. Mercer placed the notebook back inside the leather case. "I would like to visit the fields again today." Nolan reached for his hat. "We were heading there anyway." The three men drove toward the Sutton farm along the same dusty road that cut through miles of cotton fields. The sky stretched wide and pale above the land, the kind of open Texas sky that made a person feel both small and strangely calm at the same time. When they reached the fence line, the workers were already moving through the rows. Canvas sacks brushed softly against the plants while the sun climbed steadily toward noon. Harold Sutton raised a hand from near the wagon when he saw the vehicles arrive. Mercer stepped out of the sedan and stood quietly for a long moment, studying the field before speaking. "Efficient operation," he said again. Nolan rested his arms on the fence rail beside him. The farmers here depend on it. Mercer's eyes moved slowly across the rows. The workers moved in steady lines through the cotton plants, each person following the quiet rhythm that had shaped itself across the field over the past weeks. Elsa Reinhardt worked near the center rows once more, her hands moving carefully among the plants as if each one required the same attention she had learned in her father's watch shop years earlier. Mercer noticed her immediately. He watched the way she moved, the small pauses when she adjusted a plant or helped another worker shift a heavy sack onto a shoulder. Finally, he spoke quietly. She seems observant. Nolan did not look surprised. She pays attention. Mercer nodded slowly. That can be useful. Deputy Frank leaned against the cruiser nearby, arms folded while he listened to the conversation. The morning passed quietly beneath the steady Texas sun. Mercer asked a few simple questions about the work schedules, the water supply, and the supervision procedures. Nolan answered each one calmly. Harold Sutton joined them occasionally to explain details about the irrigation lines and the cotton yield. By the time the noon whistle echoed across the field, the temperature had climbed well past 90 degrees. The workers gathered beneath the oak tree again while the shade spread across the dusty ground. Mercer watched closely as the prisoners filled their tin cups with water from the barrel. His attention settled on Elsa again when she finished drinking and placed the cup down carefully beside the barrel. As she had done on several previous days, she walked toward the road where Nolan stood beside the fence. Mercer observed the movement without speaking. Elsa stopped a respectful distance away and nodded politely to the sheriff. Nolan tipped his hat. Their exchange lasted only a moment. A few quiet sentences about the heat. A brief acknowledgement. Then Elsa returned to the shade where the others rested. Mercer watched the entire interaction without interrupting. When Elsa walked back toward the oak tree, he turned toward Nolan again. How long has she been assigned to this field? Nolan answered calmly. Several weeks. Mercer nodded. And you speak with her occasionally. Nolan did not hesitate. When she approaches the fence. Mercer's expression remained thoughtful rather than suspicious. Does she cause problems? Nolan shook his head. Quite the opposite. Mercer looked back across the rows where the workers soon returned to their steady pace through the cotton plants. The breeze moved gently across the field, rustling the leaves with a soft paper sound that seemed almost too quiet for the tension slowly building beneath the surface. Mercer finally spoke again. Sheriff Briggs, he said calmly. Nolan turned slightly toward him. Yes, Major. Mercer rested one hand lightly on the fence rail while studying the horizon where the cotton rows faded into the distance. Sometimes the most interesting stories in wartime are not the ones people try to hide, he said. Nolan waited. Mercer glanced briefly toward the middle rows where Elsa continued working with the same quiet focus. They are the ones people do not realize they are part of. The afternoon sun climbed higher above the fields while the workers continued their steady rhythm among the cotton plants. Deputy Frank shifted his weight against the cruiser while watching Mercer carefully. The major closed his leather case and placed it beneath his arm once again. I believe I will remain here a few more days, Mercer said calmly. Nolan adjusted the brim of his hat. Briscoe County does not change very quickly. Mercer allowed a faint smile. Sometimes that is exactly why it becomes interesting. The breeze moved slowly across the open land while the wide Texas sky stretched above the quiet fields. And somewhere far beyond the horizon, the distant sound of a train horn echoed once more across the afternoon air, long and steady, as if the quiet decisions forming in Briscoe County were beginning to travel farther than anyone standing beside that fence had expected. Major Eugene Mercer began asking different questions on the fourth day of his stay in Briscoe County. Until then, his work had followed the rhythm of observation. He had watched the fields. He had walked through the courthouse records. He had spoken with Harold Sutton about irrigation pumps and crop yields. But that morning the tone shifted slightly, not dramatically, just enough that Sheriff Nolan Briggs noticed it immediately. The government sedan arrived again shortly after sunrise and stopped in front of the sheriff's office with the same quiet authority it had carried since the first day. Nolan stepped outside before Mercer reached the door. The air still held a trace of early morning coolness before the Texas heat settled over the land again. Mercer removed his hat politely. Sheriff Briggs, he said. Nolan nodded. Major. Deputy Frank Pritchard stood near the cruiser with a cup of coffee in his hand, watching the exchange carefully. Mercer did not open his notebook this time. Instead, he looked across the quiet courthouse square for a moment, as if organizing his thoughts before speaking. I have been reviewing several details about the prisoner labor assignments, he said calmly. Nolan waited. Mercer turned back toward him. One name appears frequently in the reports from the Sutton farm. Nolan already knew the name before Mercer said it. Elsa Reinhardt, Mercer continued. The morning breeze moved gently across the square while the courthouse clock ticked toward 8. Nolan rested one hand lightly against the office door frame. She works efficiently, he said. Mercer nodded. That is what the records indicate. Frank took a slow sip of coffee while listening. Mercer continued speaking in the same measured tone he had used since arriving. According to the field reports, she has assisted with irrigation adjustments, crop inspection, and several minor health concerns among the workers. Nolan did not appear surprised. She pays attention. Mercer studied him carefully. Yes, that seems to be the consistent observation. The three men stood quietly for a moment while a delivery wagon rattled slowly past the courthouse steps. Mercer finally spoke again. Sheriff Briggs, would you mind if I spoke with her directly this afternoon? Nolan considered the question briefly. She works under the supervision of the farm program, he replied. Mercer nodded. And I will respect that supervision. Nolan adjusted the brim of his hat. Then I see no reason to prevent it. The drive to the Sutton farm that afternoon felt slightly different from the previous days. The same cotton fields stretched across the land. The same dusty road curved toward the fence line beside the rows. But the quiet understanding between the men and the vehicles carried a new weight that had not been there before. When they arrived, Harold Sutton greeted them with a brief nod before returning his attention to the wagon where several sacks of cotton had already been stacked. Mercer stepped out of the sedan and walked slowly toward the fence while Nolan joined him. The workers moved steadily through the rows as usual. Canvas sacks brushed softly against the plants while the afternoon sun climbed across the sky. Elsa Reinhardt worked near the middle rows again. Mercer watched her for several minutes before speaking. She moves with precision, he said quietly. Nolan leaned against the fence rail. Her father repaired watches. Mercer glanced toward him. Yes, you mentioned that earlier. The noon whistle echoed across the field a short time later. Workers began gathering beneath the oak tree where the water barrel stood in the shade. Mercer remained near the fence while observing quietly. Elsa finished drinking from the tin cup and placed it carefully beside the barrel. For a moment she remained beneath the shade with the others. Then she began walking toward the road. Nolan noticed Mercer watching the movement closely. Elsa stopped a respectful distance from the fence as she had done before and nodded politely toward the sheriff. Nolan returned the gesture. Mercer stepped slightly forward. Miss Reinhardt, he said calmly. Elsa turned her attention toward him. Her expression remained composed, neither surprised nor uneasy. Yes, she replied. Mercer removed his hat. Major Eugene Mercer, United States Army Intelligence. Elsa inclined her head politely. Good afternoon. Mercer studied her expression for a moment before continuing. I have been reviewing the work reports from this farm. Your name appears often. Elsa glanced briefly toward the cotton rows before answering. I try to be useful. Mercer nodded slightly. That is evident. Nolan remained beside the fence without interrupting. Mercer asked his questions in the same calm tone he used with everyone else. You speak English very well, he said. Elsa answered simply. My father believed languages were important tools. Mercer folded his hands lightly in front of him. Your father was a watchmaker, I understand. Elsa nodded once. Yes. Mercer looked across the rows where the workers rested beneath the oak tree. And before the war? Elsa held his gaze steadily. Before the war, people repaired many things. Mercer allowed a faint smile at the careful answer. The breeze moved through the cotton leaves again, carrying the soft rustling sound across the field. Mercer asked another question. Do you find the work here difficult? Elsa shook her head gently. Work itself is simple. Mercer waited. Elsa continued quietly. It is uncertainty that is difficult. Mercer studied her expression carefully, as if weighing the meaning behind the words. Finally he nodded. That is understandable. The whistle sounded again to signal the end of the break. Elsa nodded politely toward both men and returned to the field where the steady rhythm of work resumed. Mercer watched her for a long moment as she moved back into the rows. Deputy Frank stepped beside Nolan near the cruiser. That seemed friendly enough, Frank said quietly. Nolan kept his eyes on the field. Major Mercer asks careful questions. Frank nodded. Mercer finally turned back toward the sheriff. Interesting person, he said calmly. Nolan did not disagree. The afternoon stretched slowly across the cotton fields while the workers continued their steady progress through the rows. The sky remained wide and pale above the land. And somewhere far beyond the horizon, the distant sound of a train horn drifted again across the open Texas countryside, long and steady, as if reminding everyone standing beside that quiet fence that decisions made in small places sometimes traveled farther than anyone expected. The following morning carried a different kind of silence across Briscoe County. It was the same sky, the same fields, the same courthouse clock marking the slow passage of time, but the quiet had gained weight. Sheriff Nolan Briggs noticed it before the sun had fully cleared the horizon. He was standing outside the sheriff's office with a cup of coffee when the government sedan appeared again at the edge of the square. Major Eugene Mercer stepped out with the same calm precision he had shown every day since arriving. But something in his posture suggested that the period of simple observation had ended. Nolan watched him cross the street while the courthouse clock struck 8. The sound echoed softly through the square before fading into the morning air. Mercer removed his hat politely. "Sheriff Briggs," he said. Nolan nodded once. "Major." Deputy Frank Pritchard stood nearby, leaning against the cruiser with his usual cup of coffee. Frank studied Mercer carefully. The major's expression remained neutral, but there was a quiet clarity in his eyes that suggested he had already reached certain conclusions during the night. Mercer spoke calmly. "I believe I understand the situation here much better now." Nolan waited without responding immediately. Mercer glanced across the square where the town had begun its usual morning routine. A bakery delivery wagon moved slowly past the courthouse steps. The diner door stood open to let the warm air inside. Nothing about. The town looked unusual. That was exactly what Mercer had been studying. Small towns develop their own balance, Mercer continued. Sometimes that balance creates outcomes no regulation anticipated. Nolan rested one hand against the wooden railing outside the office. Briscoe County has always managed its affairs quietly. Mercer nodded. "Yes, that is precisely what I have observed." Frank took a slow sip of coffee while listening. Mercer finally reached into his leather case and removed a thin folder. "I spent last night reviewing several reports from the camp administration," he said, "and the work records from Sutton Farm." Nolan watched him calmly. Mercer opened the folder and glanced briefly at the papers inside before closing it again. "Sheriff Briggs," he said carefully, "there is one detail that does not appear in any official report." Nolan did not look surprised. What detail would that be? Mercer met his eyes directly. "Your decision." The breeze moved lightly through the square while the courthouse clock ticked quietly above them. Nolan remained silent for a moment before answering. "What decision?" Mercer did not raise his voice. He simply spoke with quiet clarity. "The decision you are preparing to make." Frank lowered his coffee cup slowly while watching the exchange. Nolan adjusted the brim of his hat slightly. "Major, people in this county make many decisions every day." Mercer nodded. "Yes, but only a few of them attract the attention of Army intelligence." The words settled into the quiet space between them. Finally, Nolan spoke again. "You believe you know something about this situation." Mercer closed the folder and returned it to the leather case. "I believe I understand the direction it is moving." Nolan watched him steadily. Mercer continued calmly. "Yesterday I asked Miss Reinhardt several questions. Her answers were careful, but they were not evasive." Nolan remained still. Mercer looked briefly toward the road that led out of town toward the cotton fields. "She is not trying to manipulate anyone," he said. "She is simply choosing a future." Frank shifted his weight beside the cruiser. Mercer returned his attention to Nolan. "And you are considering helping her do that?" Nolan finally spoke. "This county follows the law." Mercer nodded once. "Yes, that is the question I spent the night thinking about." The morning breeze moved slowly across the square while the first real heat of the day began settling over the town. Mercer continued speaking in the same calm tone he had used since arriving. "War creates many rules. Most of them exist to prevent chaos." Nolan watched him carefully. Mercer added quietly, "But sometimes rules do not anticipate certain kinds of decisions." Nolan's voice remained steady. "What kind of decision are we discussing?" Mercer answered simply, "A legal one." Frank looked from one man to the other without speaking. Mercer glanced briefly toward the courthouse building behind them. Civil marriage licenses are issued in that office every week, he said. Nolan did not react outwardly. Mercer continued calmly. And the regulations governing prisoner status do not explicitly prevent marriage under civilian law if the proper authority approves it. Frank exhaled slowly under his breath. Mercer finished speaking. You already know this. Nolan met his gaze. Yes. The admission hung quietly in the morning air. Mercer did not appear surprised. Instead, he nodded slowly, as if confirming the final piece of a puzzle he had been assembling all week. Then the only remaining question, Mercer said, is whether the War Department considers such a decision acceptable. Nolan folded his arms lightly across his chest. And does it? Mercer looked toward the courthouse clock again as it moved toward the half-hour mark. That depends, he replied calmly. Nolan waited. Mercer turned back toward him. On the character of the people involved. For a moment, none of them spoke. The town continued moving quietly around them, while the sky above Briscoe County remained wide and clear. Finally, Mercer closed the leather case and placed it back in the sedan. Sheriff Briggs, he said, I will be returning to Washington soon. Nolan nodded once. Mercer added quietly, I believe I have seen enough to write my report. Frank watched him closely. Nolan asked the final question. And what will that report say? Mercer allowed the faintest hint of a smile. That this county appears to be run by people who understand the difference between disorder and dignity. He placed his hat back on his head and opened the car door. The War Department appreciates that. The engine of the sedan started softly a moment later. As Mercer drove slowly away from the courthouse square, the morning sun continued climbing across the wide Texas sky. Nolan remained standing outside the sheriff's office with Frank beside him. Neither man spoke for several seconds. Finally, Frank glanced toward the courthouse door. You think he just gave permission? Nolan looked toward the road leading out of town where the sedan had disappeared. No, he said quietly. Frank waited. Nolan adjusted the brim of his hat. I think he decided not to stand in the way. The courthouse clock struck the half hour with a clear metallic tone that echoed softly through the square, while the warm Texas wind moved gently across the quiet town. The government sedan disappeared down the road beyond the courthouse square that morning, leaving behind the same quiet town that had existed before Major Eugene Mercer ever arrived. But something inside Briscoe County had shifted in a way that did not require noise or celebration to be understood. Sheriff Nolan Briggs remained standing on the wooden sidewalk outside his office for several minutes after the car vanished into the distance. The courthouse clock continued its steady ticking above the square. A delivery wagon rolled past the diner. Mrs. Calder stepped outside to sweep the front of the bakery. To anyone watching, the morning looked completely ordinary. Deputy Frank Pritchard leaned against the cruiser beside Nolan and finally broke the silence. Well, Frank said slowly, that was not the kind of conversation I expected this week. Nolan kept his eyes on the road leading out of town where the dust from the departing sedan had already settled. Major Mercer came here looking for disorder, he replied quietly. Frank nodded once. And he did not find it. Nolan adjusted the brim of his hat slightly. He found people doing their jobs. Frank watched him for another moment before speaking again. So what happens now? Nolan turned toward the courthouse steps where the morning sunlight had begun warming the stone. Now the county continues exactly as it did yesterday. Frank considered the answer before giving a small shrug. Except for one detail. Nolan did not deny it. The rest of that morning unfolded with the same slow rhythm that had shaped every day in Briscoe County throughout the long summer. Nolan finished his paperwork inside the office. Frank responded to a routine call about a broken fence along the highway. Farmers moved wagons through the square, carrying supplies toward the fields. But just after 10 o'clock, Nolan stepped out of the office again and crossed the street toward the courthouse entrance. The wooden door opened with a soft creak as he stepped inside. The clerk behind the counter looked up from a stack of papers. Morning, Sheriff, the clerk said. Nolan nodded politely. Morning. He placed a small form on the counter. The clerk glanced down at it and raised his eyebrows slightly before looking back up again. You certain about this? Nolan's voice remained calm. Yes. The clerk studied the form again, then reached for the official stamp beside the ledger book. The courthouse clock continued ticking above them while the ink marks settled onto the page. All right then, the clerk said quietly. Nolan folded the paper carefully and placed it inside his coat pocket before leaving the building. By early afternoon, the same dirt road leading toward the Sutton farm carried the sheriff's truck once again across the cotton fields. The sky stretched wide and pale above the land while the heat shimmered above the rows of plants. When Nolan reached the familiar fence line, the workers were already deep into the afternoon rhythm of the harvest. Harold Sutton raised his hand in greeting. "Afternoon, Sheriff." Nolan nodded. "Everything running smooth." Harold wiped his forehead with the red handkerchief he always carried. "As smooth as cotton work ever runs." Nolan stepped out of the truck and leaned against the fence rail. The field stretched nearly half a mile across the open land. Canvas sacks brushed softly against the plants while workers moved slowly through the rows. Elsa Reinhardt worked near the middle again. Her hands moved carefully among the cotton bolls with the same quiet precision she had shown since the first day Nolan had noticed her stepping down from the transport truck weeks earlier. Nolan watched for several minutes before the noon whistle finally echoed across the field. The workers gathered beneath the oak tree as they always did. Tin cups tapped softly against the wooden barrel while the breeze moved through the leaves overhead. Elsa drank from the cup and set it back beside the barrel. Then she noticed Nolan standing by the fence. She walked toward the road with the same calm pace she carried everywhere. When she stopped a respectful distance away, she nodded politely. Nolan tipped his hat in return. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The breeze moved gently through the cotton rows behind them, while the distant windmill turned slowly against the bright Texas sky. Finally, Nolan reached into his coat pocket and removed the folded paper. Elsa watched quietly while he unfolded it. "I stopped by the courthouse this morning," he said. Elsa listened without interrupting. Nolan held the paper out slightly so she could see the official seal at the bottom of the page. "It turns out the law in this county allows a person to choose a future," he said calmly. Elsa studied the document for a moment before looking back up at him. Her expression did not change dramatically. She simply held his gaze with the same steady composure she had shown every day in the fields. "You are certain this is allowed?" she asked softly. Nolan nodded once. Major Mercer reviewed the regulations very carefully. The breeze moved again across the field while the workers beneath the oak tree began preparing to return to their rows. Elsa remained still for another second before answering. "Then I suppose the future has decided something." Nolan folded the paper again. "Not the future," he said quietly. "People." Elsa looked out across the cotton rows stretching toward the horizon. For the first time since arriving in Briscoe County, she allowed herself a small smile that appeared briefly and then faded back into the calm composure that defined her. The whistle sounded again to signal the end of the break. Elsa nodded politely before returning toward the field. Nolan remained by the fence while the workers moved back into the rows, and the quiet rhythm of the harvest resumed beneath the wide Texas sky. Later that evening, the small white church on Maple Street stood quietly beneath the fading light of sunset. Its wooden doors opened just long enough for a few witnesses to step inside. Sheriff Nolan Briggs stood near the altar while Elsa Reinhardt stood beside him, wearing the same simple composure she carried everywhere else. There were no decorations and no music, only the quiet voice of the minister reading the short words required by law. Outside the church, the wind moved gently through the trees while the sky darkened toward night. When the final words were spoken, the minister closed the small book in his hands. Nolan and Elsa exchanged a brief look that carried more meaning than any long speech could have expressed. No celebration followed. No crowd gathered outside the church. Only the quiet understanding that two people had chosen a path together in a world that had spent years dividing itself. Days later, Major Eugene Mercer would finish writing his report in an office nearly 1,500 miles away. The final sentence in that report was simple. It did not mention cotton fields or courthouse clocks or the sound of train horns drifting across the Texas horizon. It said only that Briscoe County appeared to be governed by people who understood something important. Because sometimes dignity did not require permission. It only required someone willing to recognize it.